Okay, so the next speaker is the Aurelio Cortese, Dr. Aurelio. So the presentation, sorry, the presentation title is the metacognition as the detection of the internal signals. Please go ahead.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for the introduction and for all of you for being still here. For some of the people from ATR, this talk might be a bit repetitive because I gave this presentation, a very similar one just a couple of months ago. But I hope you'll enjoy it. So this is about some older and recent work that we've done on metacognition. So now we'll switch to more the more I guess classic psychological definition of metacognition in behavior, and presenting some new data and some sort of new ideas about this data on how this relates to both to consciousness, but also to the way that the brain monitors internal representations and behavior. So metacognition is really the ability to reflect upon our choices, thoughts, and in the lab, when we talk about metacognition and behavior, we often measure it as confidence or decision confidence. So usually the question we would ask participants would be, how confident are you that your choice was correct? And they would give a rating from I was guessing to I was totally certain. Now this type of rating actually is meaningful in the sense that participants can report something about their experience, about their choices. Just two examples that usually when participants report that they are confident, they're more likely to be correct in their choices, or so this really means that this metacognitive sort of report that participant can give is really something about, so it's a monitoring signal about their own behavior. Now, usually, confidence tracks very closely accuracy. And so this is sort of as a possible confound to when we measure confidence and we look for its neural correlates. So if you think of sort of a task in which you might have stimuli or might have conditions that go from difficult to easy, of course you would have accuracy in the choices will increase with as the task becomes easy, and so will confidence. Now this is sort of this kind of correlation has been sort of people have known about this, but a lot of studies have sort of still nevertheless studied confidence within this context, and that has posed sort of a challenge to really identify what are the actual neural correlates of confidence, rather than just the difficulty or the amount of evidence. And so in our task, in the task that we designed, we thought, okay, maybe we'll try to sort of measure this metacognition in participants in a task in which the visual stimuli are very ambiguous. And so, fluctuating over trials, sometimes participants will be more confident, sometimes less, but the stimulus intensity will be roughly always the same. So participants were seeing this dot motion, so motion to the right or the left. They were reporting a choice, right or left motion, and then rating their confidence. And what we found is that when we use this technique that we call decoded neurofeedback, so if we can sort of reinforce the neural representation of a confidence signal, then we can train participants to be more or less confident in their choices. And we could do so by dissociating their sort of responses to confidence from their accuracy in the choices. So sort of showing that you can have a separate neural representation, separate correlates for confidence compared to the actual accuracy or the actual stimulus evidence. So this sort of suggests that you have that metacognition and therefore confidence is a separate process from actual simply the representation of maybe of the sensory evidence or the sensory processes. Maybe it's a sort of higher order process or higher order representation. And that is why if we use any modulation technique, we can impact on confidence itself, but without affecting maybe the actual decision, the first order decision. So whether it's about the perception. But one question that we had from this was whether, so here, this sort of implies that this confidence, this metacognition is about behavior, but maybe also about some internal representation. So we were wondering whether sort of these metacognitive functions, can they support the use or the control of non-conscious neural representations? So representations that are sort of, that are stochastically generated in the brain that participants may not be aware of. But if they are put in the condition of having to make a choice or a bet on them, maybe they can actually access. So we designed a task in which we were decoding a sensory representation from the brain, again, a representation of motion. You will see that this is a major sort of topic in this line of research that we have. But we were using this sort of this decoded activity, of which participants were not necessarily aware of. We were using this to define task conditions. That is, we were using this hidden representation in the brain as a condition in the task, such that if the decoded brain activity or decoded state was more likely to be of a left motion, participants had to make what we call a B choice. And if the neural representation were more likely to be of a right motion, they had to respond, they had to choose the A choice. And if they chose with the correct contingency, they would receive a reward. So over time, participants may learn to this sort of implicit or unconscious association. So first of all, we show that as participants do this task over multiple sessions, their accuracy in choosing this optimal option, the one that leads to a reward, will increase over time. You can see here that from the second session already, this is the group level, this is above chance, a small effect, but it's above chance. So during this task, participants are not seeing actual motion. They're seeing just purely random stimulus. But the brain will sort of, will process this, and the decoder will pick up sort of some elementary information about whether the representation is more likely to be left or right. And so this bias is picked, this sort of trial-by-trial bias is picked by the decoder and therefore translated into a task contingency. And participants can learn this association. But what was more interesting is that it's not just that participants could learn this task, but is that their confidence, their perceptual confidence, was tracking their accuracy. So in the first session, confidence was a bit relatively random, so it didn't really track the accuracy in choosing this optimal action. But from the second session, then participants actually started to choose to rate with higher confidence the trials in which they were more likely to receive a reward. So the trials in which they were more likely to be correct, even though all this information about all the sensory representation were actually non-conscious. And then in the third session, this was sort of this effect was much stronger. Now we also used a very simple reinforcement learning model to explain the choice behavior on a trial-by-trial basis, and then look at how the reinforcement learning sort of associate or pairs with confidence responses on every trial. And what this modeling sort of showed was that across sessions, there was a stronger and stronger association between prediction errors and confidence. Let me break this down. In the sense that on trials in which participants had a large prediction error, so here would be this lighter color dots. So it's on trials in which participants maybe expect a reward and they don't get, or they don't really expect a reward and they get one. So there's a big mismatch between their expectation and what they actually obtain. Their confidence was low. And instead, on the trials in which they were highly confident, those were also the trials in which they had more accurate predictions according to the reinforcement learning model. So this was really some kind of association between these reinforcement learning processes and these metacognitive functions. So metacognition is a self-monitoring process. I think this now we have by definition, and there is plenty of evidence, both from neuroscience and psychology. But it's also, so it's related, of course, to evidence and accuracy, but not directly. So it's not a direct translation. It's maybe more of an hierarchical relationship. And therefore, that's why we can actually modulate one without affecting the other. And although this was very indirect evidence, it has access to internal representations. And this is sort of might be used for learning a very complex problem. But I will not go into this aspect, and I will go more now into what metacognition and into sort of what type of processes might be going on in the brain when we made metacognitive judgments. So the question is, as in the title, is whether metacognition is a detection process. So whether whether giving a metacognitive judgment is an internal detection process, or this internal monitoring is an internal detection of signals. And I'll try to show you some data that we have been working on, sort of going into that direction. So to study this, we use our, again, a bit boring, but dot motion task, in which participants view this randomly moving dot on a screen, and these dots can be moving to the right or the left in an ambiguous manner. Now, we use two different tasks. One was a detection task and one a discrimination task. Both tasks had the same structure in terms of trial sequence, response, and confidence ratings, and the same sort of makeup of trial sort of stimulus evidence. So in all cases, there were about 25% of the trials that were purely noise. So there is no coherence at all. So there's no specific direction in the motion. About 2/3 were trials with a threshold motion direction, meaning that it's very ambiguous trials, but they have coherence, and a few trials with very high coherence. Now, in the detection task, participants had to respond whether the motion they saw had a coherent direction or not. And in the discrimination task, they had to tell they had to tell actually the direction of the motion. And after any of these two choices, they had to report their confidence in the choice, so whether they thought their choice was correct or not. So of course, so we tailored the task, the difficulty, especially of the threshold stimuli, such that the accuracy in either detection or discrimination was the same. So there was no difference across the two tasks because we tailored the stimulus. And indeed, when we look at the stimulus itself, now we start to find differences between the two tasks, such that for a discrimination task, participants required a lot less evidence to achieve about 75% correct compared to a detection task. So participants needed a lot more evidence, almost the double on average of the evidence to perform at the same level of accuracy. You can already see that there is a lot more variance as well within the detection task. We also look at the variance within subjects, and so there's more variation across trials or across blocks in the detection task for us achieving this match performance.
You don't give any feedback?
So participants don't get feedback on their performance. They just respond on every trial, and they don't know if they are correct or not. But their confidence, so they report their confidence on their choices, and their confidence can track their accuracy. But the stimulus evidence itself is updated every few blocks to keep the performance stable across the whole experimental session. And so you see that for detection, participants need a lot more evidence, actually. Although participants are faster in their choices in the detection tasks compared to discrimination. So although the stimuli and the task structure are identical, here we have evidence for two different cognitive, maybe even metacognitive processes. First of all, we have that we need different levels of evidence to achieve match performance. This was actually predicted by a sort of a theoretical analysis based on signal detection theory, showing exactly this pattern of findings. And we also find that detection is faster. This was also previously reported in different tasks. But yes, so far we've only looked at the behavior, not at the neural correlates. And that's where I think it gets a bit more interesting about this question of whether metacognition is an actual detection of things, or what are the correlates of this metacognitive judgment. So for this, we use a technique that we call searchlight decoding. So we have participants, we record their brain activity with fMRI. And so we have a time series of this fMRI data across the whole task. And we can look at two time points in the task, when participants were viewing the stimulus, or where participants were in the sort of delay in between, and when they were giving their responses. And we can try to decode a variety of task variables from this data. And so first of all, we'll try to decode the neural representation. So across the whole brain, we're looking for patterns of activity that can sort of differentiate between the two tasks, detection and discrimination, at the stimulus time. And for this, we're going to look at the noise and high coherence trials, which are identical in the two tasks. And although the input is identical, because the task is different, one case we have a detection, one in a discrimination, you can actually classify the two tasks very, very well across the whole brain. Strongly so in the visual cortex, but all the way to the prefrontal cortex. So there's a very strong differences in how these participants are processing this identical visual information. But we ask whether there are actually shared correlates of confidence across these two visual tasks. The reason for that is that there has been several previous studies looking at sort of how confidence or metacognition might change across tasks, across domains. So although here in both cases we're looking at sort of a visual perceptual task, this result kind of showed us that these are very different at a cognitive level. So maybe their confidence correlates in the two tasks are different too. And so we can again decode confidence with this whole brain searchlight, and we will just classify high versus low confidence. So we just look for patterns across the brain that can tell us whether participants were more likely to be on a high confidence in that trial or on a low confidence report. And when we look at the detection task, so when participants report their confidence after giving a detection choice, we find this sort of pattern of activity that can do this classification within this frontal network, mostly DLPFC, VMP, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and OFC, or lateral OFC. And one could expect, well, the confidence ratings themselves are the same in the two tasks. So maybe in the discrimination, you'd expect to have the exact same pattern of result. But it turns out that the picture is actually different. So you do have some shared areas, so some DLPFC, OFC areas that are found in both analyses. But you also have a large cluster here in more parietal areas, so precuneus and so on. It is found only in decoding confidence in the discrimination task. So showing that, yes, there are similarities between the two, but also differences. And instead, when we combine all the data of both tasks, now basically we find a sort of a combination of the two previous results, but more extended. We have more data, so decoding can be can work better. But it doesn't tell us that much. So a stronger test of this, so for these shared or differences in the neural correlates, is to do what we call a cross-decoding approach. So we train on the confidence in one task and we test in the confidence in the other task, and vice versa. And when we do this, we find slightly different pattern, but we find basically that the DLPFC and part of the basal ganglia can track this across confidence, sort of across task confidence. So are there shared neural correlates of confidence across the two visual tasks? And the answer is yes, both the DLPFC and the basal ganglia harbor this kind of general confidence signals. But one question here is how general actually are these confidence signals? So this analysis is done within participants. And if these are really sort of general confidence activity patterns, something really tracks this metacognitive function, maybe we can actually isolate a sort of some activity pattern that can generalize across individuals. And so for that, we use what we call a leave one participant out decoding with whole brain patterns. So now we use the whole brain at once, and we try to see if confidence that is, so if a decoder trained on all but one participants can actually predict the confidence judgments of a left out participant. It turns out that to some extent we can do this. And the interesting thing is that when we looked at the sort of at the map of which voxels around the brain are best, sort of, are most useful for these predictions, we find this this pattern of in the again in the sort of DLPFC, supplementary motor areas, as well as in the basal ganglia, sort of similar to what we were finding in our cross-decoding analysis. Not exactly the same, but very close. Sort of showing that yes, that these patterns actually of activity of this. So there is some kind of general confidence or general metacognitive network in the brain. But metacognition, sort of the way that we often define it, is this evaluation of a first order representation. So one thing that we can ask, given these two tasks that we have here, is whether confidence judgments are reflecting an internal detection mechanism. Now here we have a task in which we have confidence judgments, so we have metacognitive processes, and we have a task in which participants have to do detections. So we can see now if the two are actually in any way related. And the approach to look at this is, again, using a cross-decoding, but this time we're looking specifically at confidence in a discrimination versus detection choice. So the choice itself, the first order choice in the detection task. The idea being that, so confident in a discrimination, so basically participants here are reporting how likely they are that they were correct. And what we think is that this report is a sort of is an internal monitoring. Now, if this is true, then it should be similar to this detection task. In this detection choice, participants have to report whether there was a signal or there wasn't. And so if there's any sort of similarity between these two, or if there's any sort of common substrate, then we should be able to do this cross-decoding analysis, such that a decoder trained on confidence should be able to predict this yes-no choices and vice versa. And what we find is, indeed, there are some brain areas that can track these that can do this cross-classification, specifically in this network of frontal areas and the precursors. So meaning really that we have areas that, so we have neural correlates of confidence that can predict a detection choice. And a detection choice can predict confidence. So we find, I think this is still preliminary. I think we would still need more, more sort of follow-up experiments as well as analysis. But it's a preliminary evidence that it seems that yes, confidence or metacognitive processes are an internal detection mechanism. And we have planned some future analysis, future work, especially to better dissociate this idea that confidence is general across tasks, even given the same visual input. So we're planning what we call this similarity representation analysis, in which we can look across the two tasks, how similar are patterns of activity during the stimulus itself, as well as during the confidence ratings, and any other cross similarity. The idea being here that we expect that although participants are giving sort of the same type of confidence ratings in the two tasks, I mean, at least with the same definition, these might actually be different, at least given part of the sort of the two individual analyses that we had done. So to provide a summary of these this data, detection and discrimination choices, they impose a sort of a brain-wide structuring of information processing. This is when we look at identical stimuli shown in the two tasks. We find that the activity patterns are very different in the two. So sort of suggesting that there is really a different processing of the stimulus itself that depends on the demand, on the goal, on the demand of the task. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but perhaps also the insula and the basal ganglia harbor general confidence circuit. So something, maybe a core metacognitive processing circuit. And preliminary evidence that in the brain we had that confident judgment, metacognition, have a shared neural basis with a target detection, so that the two might be computationally actually very similar or the same process. Now this data and I think previous work as well sort of supports this idea that we actually have probably multiple metacognitive circuitry around the brain that keep track. There's a sort of an hierarchy of metacognitive functions. You have specific metacognitive circuits for specific, let's say, sensory information. You might have metacognitive circuits for memory. But then we also have probably, that's why this hierarchy, because we also have probably sort of a common general metacognitive circuit that encompasses all of this, in which all this lower level they would feed it now. And I think in our view also this sort of subtends a unitary sort of low dimensional consciousness representation. While we can have multiple sort of metacognitive representations in parallel, this is not possible, of course, I would say, for consciousness, in which at any point in time we only have one construct, one qualia. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. So, any question, comment from? Okay.
First, then, about the detection and the discrimination threshold difference, that's already known, but quite interesting. And is it different only when you block the detection and discrimination task, or have you tried to do the task where you just present the same stimuli and then afterwards you ask to detect or you ask to discriminate, unknown to the subject?
Yeah. So here here the task was blocked, so we haven't done that, and we find this this sort of this previously reported difference in the amount of evidence needed for the same. Or you would say for a given amount of evidence you would find different accuracy in the two, but we have not done of randomly interleaving the two tasks.
What would the model predict if you randomly ask it afterwards?
So so in that case it should probably be different, because so here the idea, and this is what I think what we see here as well actually, because people know what they are going to do, what task they're going to do, whether they have to detect and so on, even when the stimuli are identical across the two tasks, you have widespread differences in brain activity in the two cases. Now, if in the other case, when those are two randomly interleaved, you can't have this. So you should not be able to differentiate because participants don't know yet. And in that case, I suspect that we would still have a difference between the two, between the detection and the discrimination.
But just to make sure, so in the noise trial, the high coherence trial, it's always 0 or 80%.
Yes, doesn't change.
The change for the stimuli only happens for the detection and discrimination, right?
And it happens only at this threshold. This is where the difference is in the actual coherence.
Right, but also there is a potential difference for the noise and the high because of the temporal context as well, right? Because it's interspersed with the detection threshold or discrimination threshold. So that itself could.
That could also, yes. I mean, that could also impact.
But even with that, that's fine. But my specific question is that how come you can actually make a prediction that if you ask to detect or discriminate afterwards on the same stimulus, would the performance be
different? I think so. The reason for that is so participants would still know that they have only two options to respond, and they will have to probably to hold in I don't know, working memory probably the evidence. But if this is sort of what we're saying is true, that in the that for so detection here you sort of have three options that you separate. You have the two coherent direction versus the noise one. That's what you're detecting about. The discrimination case, you basically you don't care. It's sort of in a way is a simpler choices. You just have to say left, right. So I think based on that, you would expect to still have differences, but it's something that I don't know if anyone has tested it, and if not, we should. I would expect to have the same or a similar difference in that case too.
That would be, yeah.
But we'll see. To be tested.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, this is, I think, testing, two different tasks, detection and discrimination for the same stimulus is quite neat idea to approach your question, I think. But I think, so this is, a metacognitive judgment task. It involves kind of decision-making mechanism, right? And probably we are interested in any type of decision-making task. We are interested in what could be a decision variable and how decision variable is built up in the brain. And so in the metacognitive judgment task, there must be some decision variable, right? And it's probably, in the case of the simple, for example, discrimination task, people thought that it is related to, signal detection theory. The signal and the noise is probably a main factor to characterize such a decision variable. And in this comparison, so how much these two different metacognitive processes overlapping or using the same architecture probably can be, I think, asked probably better by looking at this process of the evolution of the decision variable. And so my impression of this result is that this is, the area that you found is overlapped with typical decision making area, like those that are prefrontal cortex, medial frontal cortex, and anterior probably detection of the, I think, prediction error or something, right? So it probably, I think that you would like to, I think, know further than that. I think that what could be, I think, specific mechanism for this metacognition, not just decision making. So I think decision variable, estimating a decision variable.
Yeah. So one could definitely look at the sort of this decision variable, and this is probably built in a slightly different. So actually, if you look at in this task, in the detection task, because you have different proportions, right, of what participants should respond no to what should they respond yes, as opposed to the discrimination in which is essentially the same. Now this actually impacts the way that the participants will report and the way that they will also report their confidence. Although I didn't report it here, but one thing that we find in this task is participants tend to be very good in their metacognition about the noise trials as opposed to the threshold trials, which is usually the opposite of what you would expect to find. People tend to be better about the metacognition about saying when something is present rather than absent. The reason we think this happens is because of the probably of the statistics of these stimuli. And now this, I'm talking about this because I think this is something that actually then feeds into this sort of metacognitive judgment and metacognitive processes. And with respect to the brain areas that we find, so dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and maybe medial prefrontal cortex and so on, the fact that this can be sort of translated across the two tasks, I think this to me still is relatively good evidence that this is really about the confidence itself rather than about the decision or the choice. The reason being the choices beforehand are different. So participants are giving different choices, and probably the decision variable that they are building in order to give their response and we can do a formal analysis on that as well, are going to be different because of the statistics of the stimuli that were used in this task. So that's sort of so far. But yeah, I agree that we can do a sort of formal analysis from that perspective and look for the neural correlates and how they dissociate from this.
Probably, I think connectivity analysis is more interesting. I think, well, if this represent those that are prefrontal cortex represent uncertainty, confidence, it probably accumulates some, I think, noisy information. Right? It's probably projected to some area that processes noise.
In the yes, probably in the we might expect maybe the inferoparietal cortex and other dorsal visual areas for motion. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice talk. So actually, last week I just happened to teach Bayesian decision making in my class, and my memory is a bit fresh, now. So, and I think people, those Bayesian decision making people explain so differently, right? Maybe confidence may be related to the precision of prior distribution, and perhaps the utility function may explain some of your results. For instance, the similarity between detection and the metacognition, maybe similarity in the cost function, maybe they finally, put weights on that decision. So do you have any, argument against, or is that, consistent or at odds with each other?
Yeah, so for the first part about sort of the Bayesian interpretation of confidence and the fact that sort of, I think from the Bayesian perspective, confidence is the precision and is sort of as a direct translation of the precision in the stimulus space. I think now we have I think overall good enough evidence, not only in this study, but sort of overall from previous work as well, that yes, that is the case to some extent. Then there are additional noise processes and there's additional sort of computations that happen, and that's why confidence. This is also why that we have that these confidence ratings actually fluctuate a lot on a trial-by-trial basis, even though the stimuli are quite constant and ambiguous. But regardless of that, the second point about the sort of I think this result, so about the cross-decoding of the confidence in the discrimination with the choices in the detection, I think that could be the case, and probably we would have to do some sort of formal analysis again on computing those utility functions in one and the other. We have stimulus evidence on every trial, so we can compute sort of also posterior probabilities for the choices and so on, and then see if sort of at least within this cross-decoding maybe regress out any information that is related to that. But I still think that, having said that, I still think that sort of the fact that we can actually do this cross-decoding in the first place using sort of the same time points, with the same data points in the two tasks, and that sort of, the areas themselves are probably, not going to tell us that much because we didn't have a particularly strong hypothesis beforehand. But the simple fact that this is actually this is possible, I think it's evidence that the two share some, I would say, metacognitive processes. But I think, yeah, we would have to be a bit more rigorous with that using a formal analysis with maybe Bayesian or utility functions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Aurelio-san. Okay,
Thank you.
we go to the discussion. Thank you.